Hello everyone and welcome back. My name is Gabriel and today we'll be doing some easy blending. I begin by applying a base coat of the main color we'll be using. This is burnt red from Vallejo, but any sort of reddish color for the Bolton Flademan will do. And I'll be applying this color on the cloak and on the cloth hanging off the horse. You can go with multiple layers, but I decided just to do one since we'll be adding plenty of layers when we're blending it. I must admit, burnt red is one of my favorite colors because of how well it coats everything, and when you have something really nice and thin and it just moves so well, that's what I really like in a paint. For the underside of the cloak and the cloth, we're using a purple, which is a mix of royal blue and burnt red, both Vallejo model colors. I find this just gives kind of a nice warm purple color, and this color we'll also be using to shade the upper areas when we do our blending. So I'm starting off with a thin coat of that purple. I'm just doing a rough outline of where the shadows are. That would be under creases and just kind of places you expect. You just have to kind of find what looks natural. And because we'll be using thin paints, we'll be going back and forth plenty of times. So don't worry if it's perfect. And then I'm using the burnt red to go over that. And this blending is basically just applying one paint on another while it's still wet. So you can see how it's very opaque, but they're blending together very nicely. And we'll be adding multiple layers of this to strengthen the shadows and highlights and smooth out some of the blends. The banner is a good example of how we go from a more macroscopic view of blending to a more microscopic view. What I mean by this is you get the larger volumes, so you have these large creases of how the banner is folding. Those I introduce more of the shadow color to, which is just a fancy way of saying I slap the paint in. As all the paint I'm adding though is still very thin. You don't want to add it straight out of the bottle. You're just not going to get the effect. And you can see how I'm adding the burnt red to the more upraised areas, and I'm not really paying attention to where I'm adding it at the moment. It's just the general area that would be brighter and darker. Then I go back in while it's still wet, and I just start picking out with that burnt red where those kind of smaller upraised regions would be. And what this allows you to do is basically build up the larger overall volume and then work on those smaller volumes. And so this creates something that's has the general idea across of this section is darker and this section is brighter, and then you have the subtleties in each of those smaller areas. Don't be concerned if it's not dark or bright enough at certain points, because you'll just be going over it again. This is not an immediate process. It might take several tries, so don't be frustrated if it doesn't come out looking exactly how you'd like. The great thing about this is just doing it over multiple layers means you can keep adjusting it until you find the balance you want. If you're using very thick paint and you don't like the outcome, it's much harder to shift it and perfect or at least improve the blends and the locations of the shadows and highlights. And by doing this slowly, you get an idea of what's brighter and what's darker, and then you can just build upon that multiple times. And this might sound like a lot of work doing this multiple times instead of one and done, but just throwing a wash over the red is just not going to look nearly as good as doing this. And the shield, I'm doing just a pretty simple blend of working the darker color into the kind of recesses, since it is slightly rounded. Then I'm just applying more of that base color on top, so you can see there's very little shadow and much more of the brighter color. I'm going back into the same section and reintroducing some shadows, which I'll be then blending up to lighter colors. If you want to go darker, you can of course add more layers of colors, so a darker purple, a lighter purple, then the burnt red, then a brighter red, and maybe even a brighter red after that. So you can choose how layered you want to go, but I wanted a pretty quick and effective blend that would complement the rest of the model well. And by keeping it light, this allows you to return to blending in case it doesn't look great when you complete the rest of the model. So when you do the metallics and the leather and that sort of thing, and you find you don't like how dark or light or the shapes of the cloth compared to the rest of the model, you can change that easily. And you can see I'm not using a small brush. I'm working very quickly. This video is in real time, so you can see how I just stop, switch out the colors, and then I just go back in and blend it together. And because it's wet, I'm not adding any kind of additives, no flow improvers, no retardant mediums. It's just the two paints and water. They're just interacting very nicely, but they're not so thin that they're flowing into each other and creating kind of a swill. You want to keep them separate, but and they only blend in when you blend them together with the brush. The results of this process aren't perfect, and if you want to do far superior blends and have much more contrast, you going to tournament level standards. That's when you would be putting in a lot more effort and really trying to maximize all those things and create texture, all that stuff. But for a tabletop standard, I find this makes smooth blends. It makes you feel more skilled than you are, and it's pretty effective overall, just for kind of creating a nice shift of color without just having some kind of ugly wash, because a black or brown wash over this burnt red would just look horrible. But by just adding in that purple, it really does look a lot more attractive. So consider this the next time you want to paint large surfaces like this. I thought the Bolton flayed men were a very good example to use because of how large those areas are. But the same thing goes for cloaks, even smaller sections, like maybe there's a cloth on the chest of a model or something. You can wet blend over that as well. Don't feel you're restricted to using this technique on cavalry or very large things. This was just an example. Like you can see, the shield is not a very large area, but I'm just using the same technique of the purple, the red, a brighter red, just to give a nice somewhat subtle transition of color, just to make it a little more interesting than a flat base coat. It is important to note, though, as I revisit the different sections of the model, I'm making sure that the layer underneath is absolutely dry. If it was still wet or slightly wet, you could tear up the paint. And what I mean by this is some of the water has evaporated, and the plastic, which is what acrylic is, the plastic is starting to settle and form the structure of dried paint. If you break that up, it's just going to ruin that blend, and it's just going to make it very unnatural, and you'll have harsh lines where you tore the paint up. So make sure that you're patient, and especially when you're working through a unit, this shouldn't be a problem, because you'll be doing the horse's cloth, the cape, the banner, the shield, next guy. And so by the time you return to the first one, it should be dry, but you can always use a heat gun or leave it in the sunlight as you paint the next one, just so it dries a little quicker. But be absolutely sure that it's not partially dry, because this should be quick and easy, and by undoing your work, you're just creating unnecessary frustration for yourself. And you can see at this point that I've painted most of the model. It's pretty much done, but I'm still revisiting the cloak because I wanted to give those highlights a greater intensity, and really bring out some of the colors which I think were lacking. And this is always okay to do. If you're near the completion of the model, but you feel some part needs adjustment, then adjust it. Don't feel like, oh, I've completed that step, I'm never touching it again. It's not going to take that long. If you just spend a couple minutes on each model, you just boost the highlights, boost the shadows, maybe make it a little warmer, a little cooler. Do what you have to do to make the model better, because if you paint the model and you're finished, you don't return to it, you're probably not going to fix whatever issues you saw. Well, that about wraps it up for this one. I hope you folks have enjoyed it and learned a thing or two. I'll be definitely using this in the future whenever I'm speed painting and I need some reliable results. Maybe you'll come back and see me paint. So until then, stay happy, stay healthy, and keep painting.